3 days before New Year's week, one of the most expensive lakeside resorts in northern Vermont was bleeding money by the hour because of 6 steel posts I had installed beside a little wooden bridge. Guests were canceling reservations, staff were hauling luggage through waist-deep snow, and the owner of the resort was calling me so often that his number practically lived on my phone screen. The funny thing was, none of that would have happened if they had simply stopped dumping snow onto my property when I asked them to. My name is Ethan Walker, and at the time all I wanted was a quiet winter in the small cottage my grandfather left me on Blackwater Lake. It wasn't some giant estate. It wasn't worth millions. It was just a simple place tucked near the shoreline, surrounded by pine trees and silence. Exactly the kind of place people dream about when they're stuck in traffic or trapped in office meetings. The only unusual thing about it was the bridge. To reach my cottage, you had to cross a narrow wooden bridge that stretched over a rocky stream feeding into the lake. It wasn't long, maybe 40 feet from one side to the other, but it was the only access point to my property. No bridge meant no way in and no way out unless you wanted to hike through dense woods carrying groceries on your back like a pioneer from the 1800s. For nearly 7 years, I lived there without any major problems. Then a luxury resort called Pine Ridge Lodge expanded uphill behind my land. At first, I barely noticed them. Their guests stayed mostly on the upper side of the property, and I stayed down by the lake. Occasionally, I'd see people kayaking in summer or hear distant laughter during weddings, but that was about it. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. Looking back, I think that's why what happened next caught me completely off guard. The first major snowstorm of December rolled through overnight. Around 5:30 in the morning, I grabbed my coffee, pulled on my boots, and stepped outside to clear the walkway before the sun came up. The second I looked toward the bridge, I stopped moving. There was a massive wall of snow piled directly across the entrance. Not fresh snow, not soft powder. This was compacted road snow that had been scraped up by heavy plows and dumped into a frozen mound. It looked like someone had intentionally built a defensive barrier around my property. I just stood there for a moment trying to process what I was seeing. Then I set down my coffee and started shoveling. 3 hours later, my shoulders felt like they'd been hit with a baseball bat. I'd managed to clear enough space to cross safely, but I was exhausted and irritated. Still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe the plow driver was new. Maybe visibility was poor during the storm. These things happen. At least that's what I told myself. A week later, another storm hit. This one dumped even more snow than the first. The next morning, I walked outside and actually laughed when I saw the bridge. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe they had done it again. The pile was even bigger this time. Worse, the weight of the snow had pushed against one side of the wooden railing hard enough to crack one of the support boards. That's the moment my patience ran out. I called the resort office and eventually got transferred to their maintenance director, a guy named Colin Mercer. The conversation started politely enough. I explained what had happened, told him the bridge had been blocked twice, and mentioned the damage to the railing. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "Our crews are operating inside the designated turnaround zone. They aren't entering private property." I remember staring out the window while he spoke. "The turnaround zone ends right at my bridge entrance," I said. "Your snow piles are blocking the only access to my home." Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Well," he said casually, "maybe your bridge was built too close to the resort road." For a second, I thought I misheard him. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it. Then I asked him to repeat it. He did. Same tone, same attitude. No apology, no concern. Just a smug suggestion that somehow my family's bridge, which had existed for decades before the resort was ever expanded, was the real problem. When the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour. Not angry. Not yet. Just thinking. My grandfather used to tell me something whenever neighbors got into disputes. He'd say, "The person who talks the loudest usually has the weakest paperwork." At the time, I didn't realize those words were about to save me over $100,000. Because the next morning, instead of arguing with Colin, I hired a professional survey crew. And 2 days later, when those survey markers started appearing in the snow beside my bridge, I discovered something that completely changed the game and revealed a secret Pine Ridge Lodge had been depending on for years without ever expecting anyone to notice. The survey crew arrived early on a gray morning that felt colder than the actual temperature. I watched from my porch while they unpacked equipment, checked coordinates, and moved methodically through the snow. At first, I expected nothing more than confirmation that the resort had been dumping snow near my property line. Honestly, that alone would have been enough for me. I figured I'd send a formal letter, force them to repair the bridge, and move on with my life. Instead, around noon, the lead surveyor walked over carrying a clipboard with an expression that immediately got my attention. He pointed toward a narrow strip of land running between my bridge entrance and the resort's upper service road. "You know this is yours, right?" he asked. I looked where he was pointing. "That little section." He nodded. "Every inch of it." I remember laughing. Nobody cares about 5 feet of snow-covered dirt. The surveyor gave me a look that said I should probably care. Then he explained what he had found. That narrow strip wasn't just sitting there unused. The resort's winter emergency access lane crossed directly over it. Their maintenance vehicles used it. Their fuel trucks used it. During heavy storms, emergency crews used it to reach the lakeside guest cabins. Without realizing it, Pine Ridge Lodge had built a critical part of its winter operations around property it didn't own. I felt a strange mix of surprise and curiosity. It was like finding out your neighbor had been parking in your garage for years because nobody ever bothered checking where the property line actually was. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. That afternoon, I dug through old boxes stored in a closet. Most of them contained boring paperwork left behind by my grandfather and the previous owner. Tax records, utility bills, insurance forms. Nothing exciting. Then I found an old manila folder buried underneath a stack of faded maps. Inside was a document dated nearly 10 years earlier. I read it twice because I thought I was misunderstanding what it said. Years before I bought the cottage, a severe flood had washed out part of the resort's upper access road. During repairs, the previous owner of my property had signed a temporary seasonal agreement allowing emergency vehicles to cross that 5-foot strip during one winter season. One season. That was the key detail. The agreement had a clear expiration date. No extensions. No permanentismo. No transfer of rights. Just temporary permission for a specific problem that had long since been resolved. I sat back in my chair and stared at the paper. Suddenly, Colin's confidence during our phone call made a lot more sense. Somewhere along the way, management at Pine Ridge Lodge had apparently started treating temporary access like permanent ownership. Maybe the original people involved had retired. Maybe records got lost. Maybe nobody bothered verifying anything because nobody expected the quiet guy living down by the lake to question it. Whatever the reason, they had built years of operational habits around an assumption that wasn't legally supported anymore. The next day, I contacted an attorney named Rebecca Lawson. She specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for being extremely thorough. After reviewing the survey results and the temporary agreement, she smiled in a way that made me feel significantly better. "This is actually very straightforward," she said. "They don't have permanent rights. In fact, this document is the reason they don't have permanent rights." She explained that if there had been decades of uninterrupted use without documentation, the resort might have attempted to argue for some form of implied access. It wouldn't have been guaranteed, but at least they would have had an argument. The temporary agreement changed everything. Because the document proved both sides knew the access was temporary from the beginning. It destroyed any claim that the resort reasonably believed they possessed permanent rights. Rebecca helped me prepare a formal letter. It was professional, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. The letter demanded 3 things. First, immediate cessation of all snow dumping onto my property. Second, repair the damaged bridge railing. Third, termination of all unauthorized access across the surveyed section of land. We included copies of the survey and the original agreement. Then we waited. The response arrived surprisingly fast. Pine Ridge Lodge's attorneys pushed back almost immediately. They argued that continuous use over many years had created expectations and operational dependence. The language sounded intimidating, packed with legal terminology clearly intended to discourage me. For about 20 minutes, I'll admit it worked. I sat there imagining court battles, legal expenses, and years of headaches. Then Rebecca called after reviewing their letter. "They're bluffing," she said. "They know it. We know it. The question is whether they realize you know it." That sentence changed my entire mindset. Up until then, I had been reacting. Now I started thinking strategically. We sent another letter. This one was even shorter. Any future use of the property would be considered deliberate trespass. Any additional damage would result in legal action. The resort suddenly became very quiet. Then Colin called. I could hear stress in his voice that hadn't been there before. Gone was the smug confidence from our first conversation. Now, he sounded like someone trying to put out a fire before management discovered how large it had become. "Look, Ethan," he said, "a lot of this happened before my time. Maybe there was confusion." I nearly laughed. Confusion wasn't what he called it when my bridge got damaged. Back then, according to him, my bridge had simply been built too close. Funny how explanations evolve when legal documents enter the conversation. I told him the situation was simple. Respect the property line. Stop crossing my land. Repair the damage. He promised to discuss everything with ownership. A week passed. Then another major storm rolled through. Snow fell heavily for nearly 2 straight days. I spent most of that time watching weather reports and wondering whether the resort had finally learned its lesson. They hadn't. On the morning after the storm, I walked outside and found fresh tire tracks crossing the disputed area. Not only had they continued using the route, but someone had also pushed snow against the edge of my property again. It wasn't as bad as before, but it was enough. Something shifted inside me at that moment. Not rage, not revenge, just clarity. I realized they weren't going to stop until stopping became more inconvenient than continuing. So I called a marine construction company from a neighboring town. The owner was a former commercial dock builder named Frank Delaney. After reviewing the survey maps, he asked a simple question. "You want to stay exactly on your property line?" "Every inch of it," I said. 3 days later, Frank's crew arrived with equipment that looked completely out of place beside a quiet lakeside cottage. They installed 6 steel mooring posts filled with reinforced concrete directly along the surveyed boundary. Each post stood roughly waist high. They weren't decorative. They weren't aggressive. They simply marked the edge of my land in a way nobody could ignore. When the final post was secured, Frank stepped back and admired the line. "Perfectly legal," he said, "and perfectly inconvenient." Those words turned out to be prophetic, because within hours the resort discovered what losing that 5-foot strip actually meant. Their emergency winter access lane no longer existed. Fuel delivery trucks couldn't take the direct route to the lakeside boiler system. Maintenance crews suddenly faced a detour through a rough Forest Service road nearly 2 miles longer than their normal path. Snowmobile support vehicles had to be rerouted. Supply deliveries slowed down. What nobody anticipated was the timing. The barriers went in 3 days before New Year's week, the single most profitable period of the entire year. Every luxury suite was booked. Every Lakeview cabin was reserved. Every operational delay suddenly carried a financial consequence. The first complaint came that afternoon, then another, then 5 more. A family arriving from Connecticut reportedly waited nearly an hour while staff figured out how to transport luggage through deep snow. Another guest demanded a partial refund after witnessing maintenance equipment struggling to reach one of the cabin clusters. By evening, online complaints had started appearing, and by the following morning, a high-profile family who had booked a 5-night premium stay canceled entirely. That's when the phone calls started. First Colin, then the operations director, then people I'd never spoken to before. My voicemail filled up so quickly it sounded like a customer service hotline. For the first time since this mess began, Pine Ridge Lodge wasn't treating me like a minor inconvenience. They were treating me like the person standing between them and a very expensive disaster. And the offers they were about to make would prove exactly how much that forgotten 5-foot strip of land was really worth. The first serious offer came from the resort's operations director less than 24 hours after the cancellations started piling up. He tried to sound calm, professional, like this was just a routine business discussion between reasonable adults. "We're prepared to offer $20,000 for permanent access," he said. I was sitting by the fireplace when the call came in, watching snow drift across the frozen lake outside my window. For a moment, I didn't say anything. Then I thanked him for the offer and declined. There was a long silence on the other end. I don't think he expected that answer. A day later, they came back with $40,000. Again, I said no. It wasn't because I was trying to squeeze every dollar out of them. The truth was, by that point, the money wasn't the issue anymore. What bothered me was how easily this entire situation could have been avoided. If Colin had apologized after the first snow pile, if someone had repaired the broken railing, if anyone at Pine Ridge Lodge had shown even a little respect for the fact that another human being actually owned the land they were using, none of this would have happened. Instead, they chose arrogance. They chose convenience. And now they were discovering how expensive those choices could become. Meanwhile, the resort's problems kept growing. Every cancellation hurt. Every complaint hurt. Every delay created another problem that required staff, time, and money to solve. Through local contacts, I started hearing stories. Employees were frustrated. Guests were annoyed. Managers were holding emergency meetings. One maintenance worker apparently joked that a tiny bridge had become the most powerful piece of infrastructure in the county. Honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. Then, 5 days after the steel posts went in, I received a call from someone new. Not Colin. Not the operations director. The owner. His name was Richard Holloway. Unlike everyone else I'd dealt with, he didn't waste time pretending this wasn't serious. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I'd like to solve this properly." That was the first conversation I'd had with anyone from the resort who sounded genuinely interested in finding a real solution rather than winning an argument. We met the following afternoon in a small conference room overlooking the lake. The view was beautiful, which felt ironic considering how much trouble that lake had caused both of us over the previous few weeks. Richard brought his attorney. I brought Rebecca. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. There were spreadsheets, maps, surveys, engineering reports, and enough paperwork to fill a filing cabinet. Eventually, Richard pushed a folder across the table. "This is our final proposal," he said. Inside was an offer far different from the earlier ones. $110,000 for a 15-year seasonal winter easement. Not permanent ownership, not unlimited access. A clearly defined agreement with strict boundaries and expiration dates. But that wasn't all. The resort would completely rebuild my aging wooden bridge. Steel reinforcement supports would be installed beneath the structure. Heated snowmelt systems would be added near the entrance. Protective barriers would prevent future plow damage. They would cover all maintenance costs related to the improvements. Then came my favorite clause. Every future incident involving snow, equipment, or unauthorized encroachment onto my side of the property line would trigger a financial penalty written directly into the agreement. In other words, if they repeated the behavior that started this entire mess, it would immediately cost them money. Rebecca reviewed everything carefully. After another hour of revisions and negotiations, she looked at me and nodded. The agreement was solid. More importantly, it was fair. I signed. Richard signed. Just like that, a conflict that began with a pile of snow ended with 6 figures, a rebuilt bridge, and legal protections stronger than anything I had before. A few months later, construction crews completed the bridge upgrades. The new structure looked incredible compared to the original. Stronger, safer, built to last decades. Sometimes I'd stand there in the early morning with a cup of coffee and think about how differently things could have turned out. What if I had ignored the problem? What if I had accepted the first excuse? What if I had never hired that survey crew? Most people assume major disputes are won through dramatic courtroom battles. In my experience, they're usually won much earlier than that. They're won when somebody decides to check the facts instead of accepting assumptions. They're won when paperwork is stronger than arrogance. They're won when a quiet person refuses to be pushed around simply because someone bigger thinks they won't fight back. The funniest part is that I don't actually hate Pine Ridge Lodge. I don't wake up every morning celebrating their losses. In fact, after the agreement was signed, our relationship improved significantly. The staff became respectful. Communication became professional. Problems got solved before they became conflicts. It turns out people behave very differently when property lines are clearly marked and consequences are clearly written down. Still, every New Year's season when I see the resort lights glowing across the lake, I remember those phone calls. I remember Colin telling me my bridge was built too close. I remember standing in the snow, staring at a broken railing. And I remember how quickly confidence disappeared when 6 steel posts suddenly transformed a forgotten strip of land into the most valuable real estate on the property. Now here's the question I want to leave with all of you. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted the first $40,000 offer and ended the fight immediately? Or would you have held your ground and pushed for a long-term solution the way I did? Do you think the resort got exactly what it deserved? Or do you think I should have been more flexible from the beginning? Let me know down in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this story, and honestly, I can understand parts of each argument. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a good property dispute where paperwork beats power. And remember, sometimes the smallest piece of land can teach the biggest lesson about respect.